The scent of lavender lingered in the air, a byproduct of the incense my wife, Julia, had insisted on burning ever since she began her spiritual journey. At first, I'd been supportive, encouraging even. After all, everyone needed an outlet, and yoga had seemed harmless enough. But lately, something about her newfound obsession felt off. It wasn't the yoga itself. No, it was the hours spent at the studio, the frequent, extended sessions, and the way her phone suddenly seemed glued to her side. She spoke often about Damien, the yoga instructor, with a reverence that bordered on fanatical. Damien says this, or Damien recommends that. His name had become a fixture in our home, uninvited but omnipresent. I tried to brush off the unease, chalking it up to paranoia. After all, Julia and I had been married for 10 years. She wasn't perfect, but she wasn't someone I thought capable of betrayal. At least, that's what I told myself every time I caught her staring at her phone with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The evening started like so many others. She returned home from her yoga class, her cheeks flushed and hair damp. Though not from sweat, she dropped her mat by the door, kissed me on the cheek, and floated into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. "How was class?" I asked, forcing a smile as I watched her move around the kitchen with an ease that irritated me for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. "Enlightening," she said, her voice dreamy. "Damien led us through this incredible meditation sequence. He has such a gift, you know. He really understands the energy of the group." I nodded, swallowing back the sharp comment threatening to escape. Instead, I focused on the mundane, folding the newspaper in front of me. "You're spending a lot of time there lately. It's important for my growth," she said, sipping her wine. "You should try it sometime. You'd love Damien. He's so insightful." The way she said his name made my stomach tighten, but I forced another smile. "I'll think about it." Later that evening, after Julia had disappeared upstairs to journal her reflections, I sat in the living room, the sound of the television barely registering. My thoughts were elsewhere, circling the growing unease that I could no longer ignore. My opportunity to dig deeper came unexpectedly. As I passed by her yoga bag on my way to the kitchen, I noticed her phone sticking out of the side pocket. I hesitated, the internal debate raging. This was a line I didn't want to cross. But then again, had she already crossed it herself? Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed the phone, quickly scrolling through her messages. Most were harmless exchanges with friends, reminders from the yoga studio. But then I saw the thread with Damien. Her side of the conversation was filled with phrases like, "Tonight was amazing, and you have such a calming presence." His replies were worse. "You're the most intuitive person I've worked with," and "I look forward to our private moments." Private moments. My hand shook as I scrolled further, the messages blurring together in a sickening mix of flirtation and intimacy. It didn't take long to confirm what I'd been dreading. Julia and Damien weren't just partners in spiritual enlightenment. I placed the phone back in her bag, careful not to disturb anything, and retreated to the living room, my mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Her late nights, her sudden obsession with yoga, her constant defenses of Damien. It was all so obvious now, and I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. But I needed more. I needed to confront her, to get the truth directly from her lips, and for that, I needed to catch her in the act. The thought made my stomach churn, but I knew there was no other way. As I sat there, my hands clenched into fists, I realized something else. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about trust, about the sanctity of the life we'd built together. And now, that life felt as fragile as the wineglass she'd left on the counter, teetering precariously on the edge. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I'd find out everything. The next day felt like an eternity. I went through the motions at work, replying to emails and sitting through meetings, but my mind wasn't there. My thoughts were trapped in the messages I'd read on Julia's phone and the uneasy feeling that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. Julia's yoga bag was gone, her car absent from the driveway. No note, no text, nothing. I knew exactly where she was. I made myself a coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock as minutes ticked by. Evening yoga class. Her usual excuse. Tonight, though, I wouldn't let it pass without answers. Her phone conversation with Damien still echoed in my mind. I look forward to our private moments. The words felt like a knife twisting deeper with every replay. I clenched my fists, determined not to let this slide. If there were any lingering doubts, they wouldn't last much longer. By 8:30 p.m., her car pulled into the driveway. I heard the familiar sound of the door opening and the soft clatter of her keys hitting the counter. She appeared in the doorway, flushed and glowing like always after her so-called sessions. "Hey," she said casually, slipping off her sneakers. "Long day." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, you could say that. How was yoga?" She smiled, reaching for a glass from the cupboard. "It was great. Damien introduced this new breathing technique. It's supposed to realign your chakras and help with focus." Damien again. His name had become a taunt, a reminder of everything she wasn't saying. I nodded, swallowing my anger. "Sounds productive. You should really join us sometime," she said, pouring herself water. "I think you'd like it. He has this amazing way of making everyone feel at ease." I studied her, searching for cracks in her facade, but her expression remained perfectly serene. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice measured. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. Julia retreated upstairs to shower, while I pretended to watch a late-night news segment. But my mind was already plotting. Tomorrow, I wouldn't sit idly by. Tomorrow, I'd follow her. The next day, I left work early, claiming I had a headache. I drove home and parked a few blocks away from the yoga studio, my heart pounding as I waited for her to arrive. At 6:45 p.m., her car pulled into the lot. I watched as she stepped out, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder, her hair tied back in a casual ponytail. She looked so normal, so unassuming. It made the betrayal sting even more. I stayed back, careful not to be seen as I followed her into the building. The studio was dimly lit, with soft music playing and the faint smell of incense wafting through the air. Students milled about, chatting and stretching. I spotted Damien immediately. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm, confident demeanor. He moved through the room like he owned it, his smile disarming and practiced. Julia greeted him warmly, her hand brushing his arm as they spoke. My stomach churned. There it was again. That intimacy, that closeness. She didn't look at him the way she looked at everyone else. She looked at him like he was the center of her universe. The class began, and I stayed hidden, watching through a crack in the door. Damien led them through a series of poses, his voice soft and soothing. Julia followed every instruction with unwavering focus, her movements fluid and graceful. It was almost hypnotic, the way she seemed to melt into the moment. But I wasn't here for yoga. I was here for the truth. As the class ended and students began to pack up, I noticed Julia lingering. She stood by Damien, her yoga mat forgotten as they chatted quietly. He leaned in closer, his hand resting briefly on her lower back. A touch that was anything but professional. My blood boiled. But I held my ground, waiting to see where this would lead. The room cleared out, leaving only the two of them. Julia laughed at something Damien said, her voice light and carefree. Then, to my horror, they moved toward a side door, slipping out of sight. I followed, keeping my footsteps light as I trailed them down a hallway that led to a private area behind the studio. My heart pounded, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound of water reached my ears, and as I turned a corner, I saw it, the hot tub. Steam rose from the bubbling water, and there they were, sitting side by side, their faces serene as they talked in hushed tones. Julia's hair was damp, her shoulders bare as she leaned toward Damien, her expression soft and open in a way I hadn't seen in years. My fists clenched, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The scene before me confirmed everything I'd feared but didn't want to believe. They weren't meditating. They weren't finding inner peace. This was something else entirely. I stepped forward, my voice cold and sharp. So this is what enlightenment looks like. Their heads snapped toward me, their serene expressions replaced with shock and guilt. Julia's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Damien froze, his calm demeanor cracking as he scrambled for an explanation. "Ben." Julia started, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," I said, my voice low but firm. Not another word. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their betrayal crashing down around us. I had caught them, and now there was no escaping the truth. The steam from the hot tub swirled around us, thick and oppressive, mirroring the suffocating tension in the air. Julia stared at me, her eyes wide with panic, while Damien shifted uncomfortably, his calm, polished facade cracking under the weight of my presence. Ben, Julia said again, her voice trembling. This isn't what it looks like. I let out a bitter laugh, my fists clenched at my sides. Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I suspected. Damien cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. Mr. Grant, this is just a misunderstanding. Julia and I were. Save it, I snapped, turning my glare toward him. I don't want to hear a single word out of your mouth. Not one. He raised his hands defensively, as if surrendering. Okay. I turned my attention back to Julia, who was now clutching the edge of the hot tub like it might somehow anchor her to reality. How long? I asked, my voice low and cold. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for words. It's not. It wasn't supposed to be like this. That's not an answer, I said sharply. How long? She flinched at the venom in my tone, tears welling in her eyes. 6 months, she whispered. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I staggered back a step, my stomach churning. 6 months, half a year of lies, of deceit, of her sneaking around while I sat at home oblivious. And you justified this? How? I said, my voice rising. By calling it meditation. By pretending it was about inner peace. Is this what that looks like to you? She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean to hurt you, Ben. Don't know. I was lost, and Damien. Damien what? I interrupted, my voice cutting through her excuses. Damien made you feel special. Damien filled some void you claimed I wasn't filling. Is that it? Her silence was answer enough. I turned to Damien, who was still sitting frozen in the water, looking more like a trapped animal than the confident instructor she had idolized. And you, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. What kind of man preys on a married woman? What kind of guru sells enlightenment while tearing apart a family? He stammered, his usually smooth voice faltering. I didn't. I never meant. You never meant to get caught, I said, finishing his sentence for him. That's the only thing you didn't mean. Julia reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my arm. Ben, please. Let's talk about this somewhere else. Please. I pulled back, her touch burning like a brand. Talk. You want to talk now, after 6 months of lying to my face. After I had to follow you here just to find out the truth. Ben, Don't. I interrupted, my voice firm. Don't even try to justify this. There's no excuse. I stepped back, shaking my head. You're unbelievable. Both of you. While I've been working late, trying to provide for us, you've been here, in a damn hot tub, pretending this is some kind of spiritual awakening. Julia sobbed harder, and Damien finally decided to move, pulling himself out of the water. He grabbed a towel, wrapping it around himself as if it could shield him from the reality of the situation. I think it's best if I leave, he said, his voice low. That's the first smart thing you've said. I shot back. And don't think for a second that this is over. I'll be contacting the studio's management about your extracurricular activities. He paled but didn't argue, quickly gathering his things and disappearing down the hallway. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed like a final nail in the coffin. Now it was just Julia and me, the silence between us heavier than ever. She sat there, her face streaked with tears, looking utterly broken. But I didn't feel sympathy, not yet. Not now. Get dressed, I said, my voice hard. We're leaving, and when we get home, you're going to tell me everything. She nodded wordlessly, slipping out of the water and grabbing a towel. I turned on my heel and left the room, the sound of her quiet sobs trailing behind me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive home was suffocating. The only sound was the low hum of the engine as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Julia sat in the passenger seat, her yoga mat clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stared out the window as though avoiding my gaze might lessen the weight of her guilt. My mind raced, replaying the scene at the studio, the hot tub, her admission of 6 months of betrayal. The woman I thought I knew, the one I had built my life with, had become a stranger in the span of an evening. When we pulled into the driveway, I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, staring straight ahead. Julia shifted uncomfortably but didn't move. Finally, I broke the silence. Inside, I said, my voice sharp and cold. Now. She hesitated but obeyed, slipping out of the car and into the house. I followed, locking the door behind us with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the quiet house, a stark reminder of how everything had changed. Julia hovered near the living room, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. I dropped my keys on the counter and turned to face her. "Sit it," I said, pointing to the couch. She obeyed, sinking into the cushions with her head bowed. I stood over her, arms crossed, the weight of my anger pressing down on both of us. "Start talking," I said, my voice low but firm. "And don't leave anything out." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Ben, No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "No excuses. No justifications. I want the truth, all of it." She swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "It started about 6 months ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was going through a rough patch. I felt disconnected from myself, from you. Disconnected," I repeated, my tone sharp. "So, your solution was to connect with Damien." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I didn't flinch. "I didn't plan for it to happen," she said. "At first, it was just yoga. But then, I don't know, he started paying attention to me in ways you hadn't in years. He made me feel seen." "Seen?" I said, my voice rising. "You're telling me you traded our marriage for some yoga instructor's compliments? That's your excuse?" "It wasn't like that," she cried. "I was lost, Ben. I was trying to find something to fill the emptiness." "And you thought he was the answer," I said bitterly. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I swear. I was going to end it." "End it?" I scoffed. "One. After another 6 months, a year, or when I walked in and caught you in the act." She didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. I paced the room, my anger boiling over. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've destroyed?" "I didn't want to destroy anything," she said, her voice breaking. "I was just trying to feel alive again." Her words hit me like a slap. "Alive," I repeated, incredulous. "You think I haven't felt the weight of this marriage? Of the sacrifices I've made? But I didn't run off to someone else to fix it." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I still love you, Ben. I never stopped." Don't," I said, my voice hard. "Don't throw that word around like it means something. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't relent. "You've shattered my trust, Julia. You've made a mockery of everything we built together. And for what? Some fleeting thrill, some illusion of peace." "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I was wrong. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything." I shook my head, the weight of her words doing little to ease the ache in my chest. "Fix it?" I said, my voice cold. "You don't just to fix this, Julia. You don't just patch up a betrayal this deep." She crumpled into the couch, her sobs shaking her frame. I stared at her, a woman I barely recognized, and felt the anger begin to twist into something heavier. Grief. Loss. "I need time," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "Time to figure out what comes next. But don't think for a second that we're just going to pretend this never happened." She nodded, her tears falling silently as I turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the wreckage she had created. Upstairs, I shut the door to the guest room, the walls closing in around me. I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands, as the reality of everything crashed down. This wasn't the end. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something I never thought I'd have to face, a life fractured by betrayal. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt eerily silent, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what had transpired. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word Julia had said the night before. Her excuses, her tears, her desperation to cling to what was already crumbling. It all echoed in my mind, louder than the silence around me. I forced myself out of bed, my limbs heavy. Downstairs, the smell of coffee wafted through the air, a jarring reminder of how routine carried on, even when nothing felt normal. Julia was in the kitchen, her back to me as she stared out the window, clutching her mug like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I cleared my throat, and she jumped slightly, turning to face me. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. "Morning," she said softly, her voice hoarse. I didn't respond, moving past her to pour myself a cup of coffee. The tension between us was suffocating, but I wasn't ready to break it. Not yet. I made breakfast, she said after a moment, gesturing to a plate of eggs and toast on the counter. I thought we could talk. I stared at the plate, my appetite non-existent. I don't think there's anything left to say right now. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, retreating to the kitchen table. I sat across from her, the distance between us feeling wider than ever. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence as I sipped my coffee, my mind racing with thoughts of what came next. Finally, I spoke. You need to tell Damien to stay away. From you, from this house, from anything to do with us. If he so much as looks in my direction again, I'll make sure everyone at that studio knows exactly who he is. She flinched but nodded quickly. I will. I promise. And I continued, my voice firm, you're quitting the yoga studio, effective immediately. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. I don't want to hear it, Julia. You've lost the privilege of negotiating here. She closed her mouth, her gaze dropping to her lap. Okay, she whispered. I'll quit. The silence returned, heavier now. I could feel her watching me, waiting for something. An olive branch. A sign that things could be repaired. But I didn't have it in me to give her that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I'm taking the day off work, I said finally, standing and placing my mug in the sink. I need some time to think. Ben, please, she said, her voice cracking. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But I love you. I love us. I don't want to lose what we have. I turned to face her, my expression hard. You should have thought of that 6 months ago. Her tears started again, but I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed my keys and left the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The cool morning air hit me like a slap, clearing my head just enough to focus on the road ahead. I drove aimlessly for hours, the familiar streets blurring into one another as I wrestled with the magnitude of what had happened. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the choices she'd made to protect her secret at the expense of our marriage. It was about the life we'd built together, now hanging by a thread. Eventually, I pulled into a park I hadn't visited in years. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the chaos of the city. I found a bench overlooking a small pond and sat there, staring at the water as the hours slipped by. What was I supposed to do now? Divorce felt inevitable, but the thought of dismantling our lives, of explaining everything to friends and family, made my stomach churn. And what about Julia? Despite everything, a small, stubborn part of me still cared about her, still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. But the woman she was now, the one who had betrayed me, who had carried on an affair for 6 months without a shred of guilt, was someone I didn't recognize, someone I wasn't sure I could forgive. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I made a decision. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't ready to forget. But I needed to protect myself, to take control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. I stood brushing off my pants and headed back to the car. The road ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let Julia's choices dictate my future any longer. When I returned home, the house was still. Too still. Julia's car was in the driveway, but there were no sounds of movement inside. I stepped through the door, bracing myself for another confrontation, but the sight that greeted me was unexpected. Julia was sitting at the dining room table, papers scattered in front of her. Her yoga mat and bag sat in a corner, rolled tightly as though they hadn't been touched. She looked up when I entered, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "What's this?" I asked, nodding toward the table. She hesitated, then gestured to the papers. "It's everything. Damien's texts, emails, even some receipts. I thought you'd want to see it." I walked closer, eyeing the neatly arranged evidence. It was all there. Months of secret messages, plans for private sessions, even a receipt for a weekend yoga retreat I hadn't known about. The weight of it all made my stomach churn. "You kept all of this?" I asked, incredulous. "I didn't know how to get rid of it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "And now? I figured you'd want the truth." "The truth," I said bitterly, flipping through the stack of papers. "The truth would have been telling me this 6 months ago before it turned into whatever this is." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes again. I know. I was selfish. I was stupid. And I hate myself for it. I dropped the papers back onto the table, taking a deep breath. So, what now? You think giving me this erases what you've done? Fixes it? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I don't expect that. I want to be honest. For the first time in months, I want to be completely honest. I studied her, searching for any hint of the woman I'd once trusted with my life. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her actions had physically diminished her. And maybe they had. I've already quit the studio, she continued. I told Damien I won't see him again, and I've blocked his number. I folded my arms, leaning against the back of a chair. Do you really think that's enough? No, she whispered. But I don't know what else to do. I'm trying, Ben. I'm trying to make this right. I shook my head, the anger simmering just below the surface. You can't make this right, Julia. You can't undo what you've done. You can't unbreak the trust you destroyed. Her tears spilled over, but I pressed on. This isn't just about you and me anymore. This is about everything we've built. The life we've shared. And you threw it all away. For what? For some cheap fantasy about inner peace. She didn't respond, her sobs shaking her shoulders. I let the silence hang for a moment, then continued, my voice hard but steady. Here's how this is going to work. We're separating. I'll stay in the guest room for now, but we're done sharing a life. You'll handle your mess, and I'll figure out what comes next for me. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. Ben, please. Don't, I interrupted. Don't beg. Don't make promises you can't keep. This is the reality you've created, Julia. Now you have to live with it, Bot. She nodded slowly, wiping at her face with trembling hands. Okay, she whispered. I understand. I turned and walked away, heading upstairs to the guest room that had become my sanctuary. Closing the door behind me, I leaned against it, exhaling deeply. The anger, the betrayal, the sadness, it all weighed on me, but for the first time, I felt like I had taken control. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faint sound of Julia crying downstairs. It tugged at something deep inside me, but I pushed it away. This wasn't my burden to carry anymore. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. The next morning, I woke early and began making plans. Calls to a lawyer, steps to protect my finances, and a quiet conversation with a trusted friend who had gone through a divorce. Each action felt like a step toward reclaiming my life, a life that no longer revolved around Julia's lies. By the time Julia emerged from her room, I was already dressed and preparing to leave for the day. She paused in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Where are you going? She asked hesitantly. To figure out my future. I said simply, brushing past her. You should start thinking about yours too. As I stepped outside, the weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road I was ready to walk. Alone, if necessary. The days following our confrontation were a blur of logistics and tension. Julia stayed out of my way, moving quietly around the house like a shadow. We spoke only when necessary, and even then, the words were clipped and distant. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The first step toward reclaiming my life was reaching out to a divorce attorney. The call felt surreal, like I was an actor in someone else's tragedy. But when the attorney's calm, methodical voice asked for details, the reality hit me like a freight train. Do you want to pursue a formal separation first? He asked. Or are you ready to file for divorce outright? The question lingered, heavy and unanswerable. I didn't know. Part of me wanted to burn it all down, to sever every tie and walk away. But another part, the quieter, more rational part, hesitated. Divorce was final, irreversible, and no matter how much I hated what Julia had done, I wasn't sure I was ready to close that door just yet. I'll think about it, I said finally. But for now, I want to protect my assets. I need to be prepared. The lawyer agreed, outlining the steps to safeguard my finances and lay the groundwork for whatever decision I ultimately made. By the time the call ended, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over something. At home, Julia tried to engage me in conversation, but I kept my responses curt. One evening, she appeared at the door to the guest room, holding a small stack of papers. I've written everything out, she said, her voice shaky. Everything I did, everything I felt. I thought it might help you understand. I stared at her, my anger bubbling to the surface again. Understand. You think writing it all down makes this easier to process. Do you even realize the damage you've done?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she held her ground. "I know it doesn't fix anything. But I thought, I don't know, maybe it would help you see how lost I was. How much I hate myself for what I did. I took the papers without a word, not because I wanted to read them but because I didn't have the energy to argue." She lingered for a moment, then retreated, leaving me alone with her confession. That night, I skimmed through the pages, each word a knife to the gut. She described her growing dissatisfaction with life, her feelings of inadequacy, and how Damien's attention had filled a void I hadn't even known existed. She didn't justify her actions. At least, not directly. But her words painted a picture of a woman spiraling into a version of herself I no longer recognized. When I finished, I placed the papers in a drawer and stared at the ceiling for hours. The pain was still raw, the betrayal fresh, but beneath it all, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: pity. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a small part of me could see how she had ended up here, lost and searching for something she couldn't even define. The next morning, I decided to take a step toward clarity. I reached out to a therapist, someone who could help me navigate the tangled web of emotions that had taken over my life. It wasn't easy, admitting I needed help, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. Julia, to her credit, seemed to recognize the fragility of the situation. She stayed out of my way, quietly packing up her yoga gear and avoiding any mention of Damien. One evening, she approached me cautiously. "I've signed up for therapy too," she said. "Individual sessions. I need to figure out why I did what I did, and how to make sure it never happens again." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was a small step, but at least it was something. Days turned into weeks, and the routines of life began to re-establish themselves. I focused on work, on rebuilding a sense of normalcy. Julia and I existed in the same house, but we were more like roommates than a married couple. The distance between us felt insurmountable, but for now, it was the only thing keeping the peace. One evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The therapist's words echoed in my mind. "You don't have to decide everything right now. Take the time you need to heal before making permanent choices." Julia stepped out quietly, her presence a faint shadow in the fading light. She hesitated, then spoke. "Ben, I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove I can be better, even if that means letting you go." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time in weeks, I looked at her, not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman I had spent a decade building a life with. And for the first time, I didn't see just a stranger. I saw someone broken, someone trying to pick up the pieces, just like me. "I don't know what the future holds," I said finally, my voice quiet. "But I know this, it's going to take time. A lot of time. And even then, I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand." We sat there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation. But it was a step. A small, fragile step towards something neither of us could yet define. The days began to blend together in a rhythm that was both comforting and unnerving. Julia and I had established an unspoken routine. Civil but distant interactions, conversations limited to logistics, and necessary updates. It wasn't much, but it was better than the suffocating silence of the first week after the confrontation. Therapy became my lifeline. The sessions were raw and draining, but they gave me a space to unravel the knot of emotions tangled inside me. Anger, grief, betrayal. They were all still there, but for the first time, I was beginning to make sense of them. My therapist's words echoed in my mind often. "It's okay to feel conflicted. Healing isn't linear." Julia was making her own efforts. She attended therapy sessions twice a week, often coming home with puffy eyes and a heavy silence. She didn't share much, but I noticed small changes. She was more mindful, more aware of the space she occupied in the house. She cleaned up after herself, cooked dinner without asking, and even started leaving her phone in plain view. Small gestures, but ones that spoke of someone trying to rebuild trust. One evening, she approached me cautiously, holding a stack of papers. "I talked to my therapist about everything," she said softly. "She suggested I write a letter to you, to explain everything, to own up to my mistakes." I know you're under no obligation to read it, but here. She set the papers on the coffee table and stepped back, giving me space. I stared at them for a long time after she left the room, my stomach twisting. Part of me didn't want to read her words, didn't want to reopen the wound that was only just beginning to scab over. But another part of me, the part still searching for answers, needed to know. That night I sat alone in the living room and unfolded the pages. Her words spilled out in careful, deliberate sentences, detailing the timeline of the affair, her growing dissatisfaction with herself, and the ways she had justified her actions. She didn't hold back, admitting to the moments she knew she should have stopped but didn't. And yet, woven through the narrative, was an undercurrent of remorse so raw it was almost tangible. I betrayed you, and I betrayed myself, she wrote. There is no excuse for what I've done, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope in time you can see that I'm trying to become someone better. Not for you, but for myself. Because I need to be someone I can live with. When I finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the table. I didn't feel the catharsis I had hoped for, but I felt something. Maybe it was the faintest glimmer of understanding. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but the tiniest crack in the wall I had built between us. The following week, Julia asked if we could talk. We sat at the dining table, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, she began. About how I destroyed what we built together. And you're right. I did. I don't know if I can ever repair the damage, but I want to try. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. What now? Why the sudden commitment to fixing things? Her gaze didn't waver. Because I see now how broken I was, how broken I still am, and I don't want to be that person anymore. Whether we stay together or not, I need to be better. For you. For me. For us. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Finally, I nodded. It's going to take more than words, Julia. A lot more. I know, she said quickly. And I'm prepared for that. I'm prepared for whatever it takes. The next step was tentative. We agreed to try couples therapy, not as a way to repair the marriage immediately, but to find clarity. To figure out if there was anything left worth saving. The sessions were brutal at first, forcing us to confront the raw truth of what had happened and the ways we had failed each other. Julia's vulnerability surprised me. She didn't deflect, didn't excuse. She owned her actions completely, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing a side of her I hadn't seen in years. The therapist encouraged us to set small, realistic goals, to have one honest conversation a day, to spend time together without discussing the affair, to rediscover the foundation of our relationship. It wasn't easy. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, but slowly, the tension began to ease. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Julia turned to me. Do you think we'll ever get back to what we were? I sighed, staring out at the horizon. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe we're not supposed to. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. Maybe we can be something different. Something better. The words lingered, a fragile hope that neither of us dared to fully embrace. But in that moment, it was enough. The weeks that followed felt like walking through uncharted territory. Julia and I continued therapy, both individually and as a couple, but the progress was slow, measured in inches rather than strides. Trust, I'd learned, wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. It was earned in small, consistent actions, and even then, it was fragile. Our conversations had become more open, though still guarded. I could see the effort Julia was putting in. Small gestures like leaving her phone face up on the counter, sharing details of her therapy sessions, and volunteering to take on tasks I normally handled. But even as I acknowledged her efforts, the question lingered, was it enough? One evening, our therapist suggested something that made my stomach churn. A forgiveness session. The idea was not to force forgiveness, but to give both of us a chance to express how the betrayal had affected us. And, if possible, to find a way forward, even if that path led to separation. We scheduled it for a Friday night, and as the day approached, my anxiety grew. Forgiveness was a loaded word, one that felt too heavy to bear. Could I even begin to forgive Julia? Did I want to? That night, we sat across from each other in the therapist's office, the air thick with anticipation. Julia's hands fidgeted in her lap, and I gripped the armrests of my chair, my heart pounding. Ben, The therapist began, her voice calm and steady. This is your space to share. Speak honestly about how you've been affected and what you need moving forward. I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I feel like I've been living with a stranger. The woman I trusted, the woman I thought I knew betrayed me in ways I didn't think were possible. It's not just the affair. It's the lies, the sneaking around, the way you looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine. Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. I pressed on, my voice shaking. You broke something in me, Julia. Something I don't know if I can ever fix. And even now, with all the therapy and the effort, I still wake up some days wondering if it's all just another lie. Silence filled the room as I finished, my chest heaving. The therapist gave Julia a moment to collect herself before speaking. Julia, now it's your turn. Respond, but without deflecting. Focus on how you feel about what Ben has said. Julia nodded, her voice trembling as she began. I hate what I've done. I hate the person I became, the person who could do this to you. I see the pain I caused, and I carry it with me every single day. I don't expect you to forgive me, not now, maybe not ever. But I want you to know that I'm trying. Not to win you back, but to be someone worthy of respect. Someone who can look in the mirror without feeling disgusted. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, I saw not just regret but a genuine understanding of the gravity of her actions. It didn't erase the hurt, but it chipped away at the wall I had built around myself. The therapist leaned forward. Ben, is there anything you want to say in response? I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. I don't know if I can forgive you, Julia. Not yet. But I'm willing to try. Not for the marriage we had, but for the people we can become. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But instead, she nodded, her expression one of quiet determination. That's all I can ask for. In the days that followed, something shifted between us. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter. Julia didn't push, and I didn't pull away. We found small moments of connection. Sharing a laugh over an old memory, working together to fix a leaky faucet, sitting in companionable silence on the porch as the sun set. One evening, as we sat side by side, Julia broke the silence. I've been thinking about what you said. About moving forward, not backward. I glanced at her, waiting. I don't want us to go back to who we were, she continued. Because who we were wasn't working. But maybe we can build something new, something better. Her words echoed the thoughts I hadn't dared to voice. It's not going to be easy, I said. It's going to take time, a lot of time. I know, she said softly, but I'm willing to wait, to earn it. Bah, for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected: hope. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But it was a start. We spent the following weeks rebuilding in small ways. Therapy remained a constant, providing a structured space to air grievances and explore new ways of connecting. Julia continued to work on herself, sharing insights from her sessions and making visible efforts to regain my trust. She no longer retreated into excuses or self-pity. Instead, she owned her mistakes fully, without reservation. I, too, found myself changing. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Who was Julia now? Could we create a relationship that honored our past without being tethered to it? These questions didn't have immediate answers, but I was finally willing to explore them. One Saturday afternoon, as we cleaned out the attic together, Julia came across a dusty photo album. She flipped through the pages, smiling softly at pictures of our wedding, our first home, vacations where we were both younger and brighter versions of ourselves. Do you remember this? She asked, holding up a photo of us hiking in the mountains, our faces flushed with the thrill of the climb. I took the photo, my lips curving into a faint smile. Yeah, you were terrified of slipping on that last stretch. And you held my hand the whole way, she said, her voice quiet. You wouldn't let me fall. The weight of her words wasn't lost on me. A lot has changed since then, I said, placing the photo back in the album. It has, she agreed. But maybe we can learn to climb again. Together. Her words struck a chord I hadn't expected. For all the pain and betrayal, there was still something here, something worth fighting for. But it wasn't going to be easy. The next big test came when we attended a friend's party together. It was the first time we'd gone out as a couple since everything had come to light. The night was filled with small, awkward interactions. Friends who didn't know what had happened. Polite smiles that masked unspoken questions. But for the first time I noticed Julia standing a little closer to me, her attention focused entirely on our conversations. She wasn't checking her phone or drifting into her own world. She was present. At one point, a mutual friend pulled me aside. "You two seem different," he said, glancing toward Julia, who was laughing softly with another guest. "Better, even." I nodded, my chest tightening. "We're working on it." "Well, it shows," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Good for you." His words stayed with me as we drove home that night. Julia was quiet, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When we pulled into the driveway, she turned to me. "Did it feel normal?" she asked hesitantly. "Being there together?" I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Not normal, but not bad, either." Her smile was small but genuine. "That's a start." But as the weeks turned into months, we began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before. There was no going back to who we had been. But maybe that was for the best. The cracks in our relationship had been exposed, forcing us to confront what had been broken long before the affair. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Julia reached for my hand. I hesitated for a moment before letting her take it. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm, but tentative. "I know it'll never be the same," she said, softly, "but I think we can be better, if you're willing." I stared out at the horizon, the colors bleeding together in a kaleidoscope of orange and pink. "I'm willing to try," I said finally. "But it's going to take work. A lot of work." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know, and I'm ready." The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt like we were walking it together. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would work out. But there was hope. And sometimes, hope was enough.